You're listening to Russia on the Record, a podcast from the Moscow Times. With the second anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine approaching, it's crucial that we deconstruct the pretext of historical injustice frequently cited by President Vladimir Putin as Russia's motivation. Both before and during the conflict, Putin has frequently pointed to his version of Ukrainian history to question the country's statehood. So, in this episode, we'll explore Russia's weaponization of history in the ongoing conflict with Ukraine. But first, let's catch up on this week's news. Russia has issued an arrest warrant for Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, marking the first time the country has ever opened a criminal case against the head of a foreign government. The Interior Ministry confirmed that Kallas was added to its wanted persons list for backing the dismantling of a Soviet-era memorial in the Estonian city of Narva, which sits on the border with Russia. The memorial, depicting a tank at the point where the Soviet army entered Nazi-occupied Estonia, is one of the 200 to 400 monuments that the Estonian government pledged to take down in 2022. Kallas is a vocal supporter of Ukraine, and Estonia, both a member of NATO and the European Union, has supplied over $500 million of aid to Kiev under her leadership. The Kremlin confirmed that President Vladimir Putin will not take part in televised debates during next month's presidential election. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said this was due to his busy schedule. Putin is almost certain to be re-elected to a third consecutive term, 24 years after he was first elected to the presidency. All three candidates running against Putin have voiced their support for the war in Ukraine, and the one pro-peace hostful, Boris Nadezhdin, was barred from running last week after the body that approves candidates claimed to have found irregularities in his endorsement signatures. Putin has signed a law allowing the authorities to confiscate the assets of people convicted of discrediting or spreading fake news about the military. Unlike similar Soviet legislation, the law does not allow for the seizure of property, but people convicted of extremism and calling for so-called anti-Russian actions could still have their money and valuables taken. Criticizing the Russian military has been outlawed since shortly after the full-scale invasion in February 2022, and spreading, quote, fake news about the army carries a maximum jail sentence of 15 years. Ukraine says it has destroyed yet another Russian warship in the Black Sea. Footage shared by Ukrainian military intelligence showed the Caesar Kukinov landing ship being attacked by maritime strike drones. Elsewhere in the war, Ukraine also claims to have uncovered evidence of Russian soldiers using Starlink satellite internet terminals. Thousands of these devices, which link up to satellites to provide wireless internet, were supplied to Ukraine in the early days of the war after cyber attacks and the Russian army destroyed communication links. They were critical in allowing the Ukrainian army to coordinate its counteroffensives. Starlink and its founder, Elon Musk, both said that Starlink terminals are not for sale in Russia or Dubai, which had been suggested to be acting as an intermediary. But an investigation from Radio Liberty found that through simultaneous imports, it was still possible to purchase the devices in Russia, as is the case with other restricted goods. Russian pop star Philipp Kirkorov visited the occupied Ukrainian region of Donetsk this week, after he was caught up in a scandal surrounding a nearly naked party that threatened the careers of several Russian celebrities. Kirkorov was filmed singing for wounded soldiers and said that he brought humanitarian aid with him. Shortly before his appearance in Donetsk, Meduza reported that Kirkorov appeared on a list of musicians who were banned from performing in Russia. His visit came weeks after singer Dima Bilan, another guest at the nearly naked party, visited Donetsk to deliver humanitarian aid and visit children in a hospital. Days before invading Ukraine, Putin gave an hour-long address where he claimed that the country was created by Lenin. 2 years later, in an interview with Tucker Carlson, he reiterated his view that Russia and Ukraine are not separate, but one nation. In fact, a quarter of this 2-hour interview was dedicated to Putin setting out his version of history and his belief that Ukrainian independence is a, quote, historical injustice. Researcher Jane McGlynn joins us to discuss the mechanics and motives behind Russia's weaponization of history and why Ukraine is the primary target.
Russia's use of history as a propaganda tool had been on the rise ever since Putin came to power, but reached new levels after 2014 and after the 2022 invasion. Can you give us a short overview of how the Kremlin's distorted version of history has fueled Russia's aggression against Ukraine?
You're right, very much since 2014, although you could go back further, for example, to 2012, which was the year of history, and then you had the launching of the Russian Military Historical Society and of the Russian Historical Society. And they were important because they produced a great deal of popular culture, which is bluntly probably what more people are likely to engage with. So the spate of World War II films or Great Patriotic War films in which Ukrainians are always presented as traitors or as people who are a bit silly, village idiots, but essentially understand that they are Russian. And in that case, they're the good guys. And through all of this, as well as, for example, the popularity of the popadnichestvo genre of books, where you can go back in history and fix various elements, they all contributed alongside the very, very insistent use of historical analogies, in particular, the comparison of what was happening in Ukraine in 2014 during the time of the Revolution of Dignity to some supposed return of Banderivtsi and a need for Russia to refight the Great Patriotic War. That all contributed to making history not really about history at all, but actually about what was happening in the present day and to making it relevant, to making these historical, very emotive episodes relevant. So if we think back to the fire in Odessa at the trade union house, and that was immediately conflated with Hatyn, the burning by Ukrainian nationalists of village in Belarus during the Great Patriotic War. And that was also a very central part of the Brezhnev era mythscape of the Great Patriotic War as well. So it would have been known to many of those, particularly of older generations who were watching what had happened in the Odessa trade union house fire. And this constant, I suppose, reaching into events that you know resonate, into historical episodes that you know are emotive to people, and using them to anchor a certain way of interpreting Russia's aggression and Russia's war against Ukraine. It works. Of course it works. It's not, and I would say as well, it's very much not something specific to Russia. What is specific to, well, perhaps not specific, but perhaps what is more pronounced in Russia is the extent to which history has also become a motivating factor. So everybody uses history as propaganda, right? We have to be honest. But not everybody uses historical grievance as a motivating factor to the extent that we have seen. And what's interesting, often, particularly if you look at, say, Vladimir Putin or other kind of ideologues such as Vladimir Medinsky or Sergei Naryshkin, is that interplay between their own propaganda and the historical grievance upon which they act, which unfortunately has taken a rather radicalizing turn the longer it's continued.
Why is it Ukraine and not some other country of the ex-USSR that has become Putin's political weapon?
That's a really important question. I think that's really the crucial question, because it also, in a way, you could have phrased it separately as well to do with NATO. So I'm going to try to merge all of these elements in. It's Ukraine because Ukraine is central to the post-Soviet myth or the post-Soviet creation of a Russian identity, which is very focused around this sense of not just history, but that Russians have a 1,000-year history and that Russians have some sort of innate, uniquely insightful understanding of their own history. They are in touch with their history, with their roots, traditions. They are authentic, unlike the West, which has forgotten itself, its history and its roots. But if you go into Russian history, of course, a lot of these narratives depend on Ukraine. So they depend on the idea Russia's 1,000 years of history, which is now enshrined within the constitution after 2020 changes, goes back to the idea that Russia comes from Kievan Rus. And, you could have a pretty decent historiographical debate about that, which I won't do because actually it's sort of besides the point, right? The history isn't what matters. It's why they're using it and for what reason. And of course, if Russia is this innately great power, then why can't it take Kharkiv, 40 kilometers from the border? If it's, this great, innately wonderful culture, that appeals far beyond its borders, far beyond the ethnic Russian people who are its carriers, why didn't people in eastern Ukraine greet them as liberators? they also read. You can go to many destroyed schools in Kharkiv region and see there's still there images of Tolstoy and of Pushkin that they studied, but it didn't mean that they wanted to be part. And so Ukrainian identity is a direct, and Ukrainian resistance to Russia's control is a direct threat, I suppose, to Russia's sense of the elite-driven Russian sense of what it is as a country, a great power, with 1,000 years of history, with its roots sort of in this wonderful Kievan Rus, and of course also a sort of a cultural hegemon that has this sort of mission as a separate civilization. But if you have Ukraine wanting to join, in Russia's view, a different civilization, it all starts to fall apart. I mean, the other aspect as well would be to do with the Great Patriotic War. And this is an issue that's not just specific to Ukraine, which is the Great Patriotic War is a large part of Russia's geopolitical understanding of its right to a certain role. So you often hear Vladimir Putin referring to, we need to defend the results of World War II from those people who are trying to overturn it, which is a very interesting phrase. And essentially, and you'll find it in the foreign policy concept as well of 2023. And what it's referring to is the post-Yalta system. So because Russia, as the successor to the Soviet Union, beat Nazi Germany, therefore it has the right to control over certain countries, and Ukraine would be one of them. And Ukraine's experience in the Great Patriotic War is a deeply complicated one, especially when it's combined with, the experiences of the Holodomor and the Great Terror. And it's very difficult to turn Ukraine's experience of the Second World War into anything that fits, I suppose, the heroism narrative. Not because there weren't heroes, there were, but it's just such an epic scale of tragedy that affects the entirety of the country, and in many sort of not necessarily always in nice, easy black and white ways, that Ukraine's own, I suppose, engagement with what happened and its rejection of the Great Patriotic War myth, though not of the Second World War, that also then, just as other countries have done, that also then shakes the foundations upon which Russia's justification for its sort of right to control other countries stands upon.
Do you think they see the war in Ukraine through the same revisionist lens?
I think that when you get into NATO expansion, it essentially comes back to the same thing, because we all understand why there was no real reaction from Russia or Russians in general in terms of like the annoyance at it to Finland joining NATO. We all understand why, because Finland isn't Ukraine. But why isn't Finland Ukraine? It used to be part of the Russian Empire. It has a long border. Okay, not as long as Ukraine's, but still pretty long, 1,300 kilometers with Russia. So why doesn't it matter if Finland joins NATO, but it would matter if Ukraine joined NATO? Because Russia thinks that it has a right to Ukraine, right? That it has some kind of special right over the country. So then we sort of get back to what we're talking about anyway, which is an imperialist vision buoyed by a sort of historical grievance or sense of historical ownership over Ukraine. Do I think that resonates with Russians? Yes, I think that on different levels it does. Does that mean that all Russians believe that there are Banderovцы running amok across Ukraine? No, it doesn't. Though there certainly are some. I remember speaking to a friend whose family had been in occupied Kherson region, now since deoccupied, since liberated, and they had Russian soldiers coming to their house and asking them, where is Stepan Bandera? Demanding to know. So obviously the propaganda's got a bit confused there at some point, but it's getting through. The notion, what I would say resonates based on my studies since 2014, would be the notion that there's something extreme and nationalist about Ukrainian national identity. The notion that there's something wrong with it, which I think is summed up in this insistence on calling everybody Banderovцы. So the idea that you can't just support Ukrainian identity, language, and not want anything to do with Russia without being an extremist and essentially a Nazi collaborator. I think that is a resonant. And I think it resonates because it's experienced as a rejection. It's a way of handling rejection. Obviously, lots of Russians, understandably, I can sort of, if I put myself in Russian shoes, if I think about it in an English context, if Scotland voted to leave Britain, I would also feel a bit rejected, as silly as that sounds, just because, I'm English. So and you would then try to come up with some ways to perhaps sort of tarnish the group that you feel rejected by. That's a completely human reaction. It's just because it's been encouraged on like a state and propaganda level and has built on Soviet propaganda and disinformation. It's obviously taken an unhealthy scale. So that would be the first point. The second point is I think that many Russians do appear to believe that Russian speaking or Eastern Ukrainians genuinely do feel a great sympathy towards Russia. And I think during my interviews after 2022, that was the kind of sticking point that came up a lot with people that I spoke to who supported the war or had come to terms with the war, maybe the full-scale invasion, is they found it really hard to come to terms with the fact that clearly they were not greeted as liberators in Kharkiv, to put it mildly. And they really struggled with that aspect. And I think it seemed to me that, to my interviewees at least, it was very painful for them. The notion that Ukrainians really did not see them as brothers, were not happy to see them, even those in parts of Ukraine that some Russians think are Russian, like Kharkiv or Odessa. So that would be the second point. And then the notion that Ukraine isn't a real country. I think that resonates pretty well in Russia. And sometimes I think it resonates as well with people who aren't necessarily pro-Putin. The idea that Ukraine is second-rate in terms of Ukrainian culture, the idea that it shouldn't be allowed the same pretensions to sort of a cultural role. I think you'll find that beyond just Vladimir Medinsky's scrawlings.
How else does Russia's wartime weaponization of history impact society? For example, in younger generation studying from Kremlin-approved history textbooks, something else?
Yeah, that's important, especially because since 2022, we've seen a big shift from things being strongly encouraged to becoming mandatory. So, for example, last year, 2023, there was the new philosophy of education, which saw new advisors being brought in to schools to advise the head teachers or the principals for American English speakers on how to ensure that the children were getting patriotic education. And you've seen patriotic education has now become a mandatory part of schooling, whereas before it was just deeply encouraged. So we've seen organizations like, for example, Voin, which is also now working in the occupied territories of Ukraine too. But it's won incredibly large contracts considering it's existed for about a year and a half, for only a couple of years, basically since the start of the full-scale invasion. And their job is to focus on turning young men essentially on training men for war, really, but in a kind of more of a psychological way, let's say training young boys, to become men who go to war. And there's a real emphasis. If you look at their contract, for example, in Khabarovsk region, there's a real emphasis there on that they should be focusing on young boys nearing conscription age. And I think that's something that needs to be reckoned with in as scholarly a way as possible, because you have this intense propaganda. You have this training within schools. You now have them bringing in patriotic education and, of course, soldiers to deliver, lessons like conversation, like разговоры о важном, like about the important things. And you also have the sidelining of teachers who generally have been a moderating experience. We can think of plenty. I mean, Moscow Times has covered, innumerable occasions where teachers have essentially said, we are not having a Wagner fighter come and teach our children about this or that. And so it's very sad to see that they're being sidelined, because that's another moderating influence being sidelined. In some ways, a lot of hope rests on YouTube, because YouTube, of course, is still not blocked. And, there are a number of, when you look at sort of what history channels young Russians are watching, they're pretty normal. So the hope has to be that between VPNs and YouTube, people are still going to be receiving some normal history. But I would suggest that the key narratives will seep in all the same, whether or not the desire to go and join a PMC the minute you finish school does.
For a long time, Kremlin watchers, Putin's interview with Tucker Carlson was a classic look at his distorted version of Ukrainian and Russian history. But Western audiences were largely baffled by his 30 minutes history lecture. Could Putin's fixation on his historical narrative actually damage his efforts to win over right-wing people in the West like he wants to?
Yes, I think it will. I mean, for me, I remember doing an interview just before the Tucker Carlson interview, and I said, I'll be really shocked if there's anything that surprising that comes out of this, because Putin has written and said a lot about, his views on Ukraine. And if anybody in the West bothered to read them, then people would probably stop talking about, certain kind of key discussion points. But it was amusing to see Tucker Carlson desperately trying, again and again to get Vladimir Putin to say, it was all NATO expansion. And actually he's like, well, there was Yaroslav Mudry and, in this year and that year. But yeah, it was baffling for people in the West, which I think, to be honest, reflects really badly on the West and on our understanding of Russia, because it really shouldn't have been at this point. It really shouldn't have been. This war is clearly about Russian conceptions of itself, its own right, often its own rights in the world, its own role in the world, steeped in historical grievance, and the very peculiar role of Ukraine for Russia to be able to feel like it has assumed that role. And I think that part of the reason for that is that if you begin to engage with the reality of the invasion, such as Putin laid out during his Tucker Carlson interview, such as he's laid out again and again and again, then you understand that this is not something that can be easily swept under the carpet or just, okay, well, what about if we just give them Zaporizhia, then it will be fine. That this is about something much more fundamental. It's about ideas. It's about a huge difference in ideas of how the world works, how the world should work, what is the role of the state, what is the role of culture. It's just a huge chasm. And I think, unfortunately, in the West, we've become so self-absorbed. We forgot to try to understand how, in this case, the opponent, but at least the other side, or just different people think. Instead, there's just a delegitimization of the other side. I mean, in this case, it might be appropriate, but is it going to help you to understand better and therefore to respond more accurately? No. So it's not especially a useful form. Do I think that Putin's historical ragings will have any impact on his ability to attract sort of the alt-right, if they're still called that, or the right-wingers, extreme right-wingers in the US? I'm not sure. I mean, I think in general, he won't attract any new people with that. It's, of course, alienating. Very few people in the world want to learn that much about Yaroslav Mudry, even if it were accurate, which obviously it wasn't. But on another level, I think the problems that we see there are pretty similar to the sort of problems that we see in Russia. I mean, a lot of people want to believe the sort of things that Tucker Carlson is pushing. And if you want to believe it in this day and age, you'll find enough information to support that anyway, regardless of what Putin or anybody else comes out with.
Does this weaponization of history mean that peace is impossible as long as Putin denies Ukraine's existence as a country?
No, I don't think it means it is impossible, but I think it means it's impossible to negotiate with Putin as if he were somebody acting in good faith. Essentially, Russia's position is quite clear. Russia thinks that it should control Ukraine. In the sense, doesn't necessarily have to be a full-on occupation, but Russia thinks that it should have, I suppose, a decisive control over Ukraine's sovereignty. Ukraine should not be a fully sovereign country. Ukraine, of course, feels otherwise. We saw it on the 24th of February 2022 that essentially if Ukraine had not fought for its survival in the incredibly courageous way that it did, the West probably would have left it to Russia, if we're honest. Of course, Ukraine fought back, and the rest is to a certain extent history, but also still ongoing. Can there be peace? There can, but only, I don't think at this point that Putin, or indeed perhaps even some of the people who come after him, because the war is going to have has already changed so much about Russian society and has changed so much about the people who are in the elites and the way that they function. I don't see a situation where they are going to stop trying to conquer more of Ukraine, or indeed ever willingly give up any territory in Ukraine, unless they are made to. So I think that peace, as or slightly Orwellian as it sounds, can only really come through a demonstrative show of force, because we've seen this. I feel like I'm old enough to remember 2014. Most people are. And we tried this. Everybody tried different aspects, just gave up Crimea. They fought for Donbass, but they didn't fight too hard. They tried to do negotiations. Ultimately, the only thing that will bring peace is Russia not being able to ravage Ukraine. That's the only thing.
What other countries are using a similar strategy of weaponizing history today?
Pretty much every other country, but China's especially interesting, particularly because you have sort of memory alliances between Russia and China around the Great Patriotic War and the People's War of Liberation, as it's called in China. So, and there's also that idea of, if in Russia you have the 90s myth, this sort of humiliation at the hands of the West, you have a similar myth in place in China, although it then gets a little bit awkward because its myth also cast the Russians as sort of imperialist Westerners because they were, at this period. So actually sometimes that can lead to tensions. There have been interesting studies showing the Chinese censors have to work overtime to remove kind of these bad references to Russia. But in any case, in the UK, we have it actually in a way that's very similar, except of course, the intensity is lower. And also in some ways it becomes more polarizing because of course there's more freedom of speech here. But in the UK, we have a very similar use, actually, of World War II, this idea of, Britain stood alone. We saw it during the Brexit referendum. There was an incredible sort of focus on the idea of, well, we stood alone in 1940, we can do it again. And of course, nobody welcomed being told, well, we didn't really stand alone. We had an empire and, this and that. And actually, Churchill was basically desperate for America to join. And his entire plan was to just wait until America joined. No, I mean, I'm simplifying. I'm obviously not a World War II historian, but nobody appreciates having the myths disrupted because every nation needs its national myths. It's how you tell a story about who you are, where you came from, why you belong together, what your characteristics are. It's good and it's natural. The problem is when the historical myths start to then become almost a different way of interpreting what is good and what is bad. So it doesn't matter if we are now bombing innocent civilians, and this could apply to more than just one country in the world right now, because actually in World War II, this happened to us and that could happen again. That's when it becomes a problem, is when it starts to become a justification, a motivating factor. And that's, of course, where we are with Russia and with some other countries. I'm really pleased that everybody's paying more attention. Everybody's paying more attention to the weaponization of history in Russia. But I think one of the things that sometimes tires me out is if the Western media make it out as if this is a peculiarly Russian thing, as opposed to something that everybody does. And that actually in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. Historical analogies are helpful. The issue is, I suppose, the final point that I just made, when it's used to overcome a basic sense of morality, to supersede that. And I think that's what we see with the uses of the Great Patriotic War, particularly in relation to Russia's war in Ukraine.
Thank you for listening to Russia on the Record. Be sure to follow us on your favourite podcast platform to make sure that you do not miss our next episode.